Welcome to our video over the Formula Designer specific to version 9. So this is a great new feature that we've added in version 9, and I'd love to share a lot of things with it, how to build with it, a couple of great things. It's got a lot of versatility and a lot of great ways that we can utilize some things in decisions. So first thing that's important to note, this is a feature that was added in version 9.3, so we can utilize it anywhere after version 9.3, but anything before that, it does not exist yet. So anything else, version 8 or the earlier versions of 9, these things would have to be built out in a flow with other steps and things. But later, we've added the ability to build these formulas out in a new designer. So there's four ways that you can create this, first of all, similar to how you can kind of create rules in a couple different places. The first one is under the create rule category, just like you would to create a new flow or create a new rule. If you click create a new rule, there's a tab for formula, and you can build a formula from there. You can also build it from the flow designer by grabbing the run formula step, and then from there you can pick an existing formula, or you can just create a new one if you want to create a new one from there. We also have added the ability to create a formula in the rule designer. So if you open up a brand new statement rule, you'll see at the very top this declare option. And then if you click add, it'll take you to the formula designer so that you can build a new formula to create that can be used in that rule and then referenced in other places as well. And then also during mapping. So if you're mapping something in your flow, you'll see under the options to choose from instead of constant and select from flow and all those things, there's actually some formula options. So you can create a new formula by selecting formula, or if you already have a formula that exists in your current project, you'll see a formulas drop down that can display those formulas to choose from. So quite a few different ways that you can start building and creating your formulas in decisions. Let's take a look at the designer now. So in your formula builder designer, we do have 4 tabs to choose from that'll kind of allow you to set up and display the information. First tab is configure. This is just your basic setting your basic configuration options. Here's where you set up the name, what that formula is going to be called, the inputs, so you can set up the inputs here, whatever data you want to utilize. Something that's important to note here is the default input data will be double as the data structure or the data type. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't really change that much. You can still choose any input you want. You can make it strings. You can make it, file data, whatever that is. You still have all those options for the possible inputs, but the default is now double since that is going to be more often than not utilized in these formulas here. And then you'll also have outputs. This output is not editable, something that's very important here. It'll change and show you the output based on the formula that is being used. So if your formula is supposed to output a number, then that will be the output type. If your output is supposed to output something else, it'll change to address that. But more often than not, it'll also be the double type because it's outputting, most of these are outputting numbers. Your second tab is the Functions tab. Now, the Functions tab is going to be displaying all of the available formulas and functions that you can use. They're grouped into different categories, but they're also searchable, so you can search for whatever you're looking for. But if you have list-based functions that you want to use, maybe you want to use conditional things. If you want to utilize specific finance functions, those are all available here. You can find them, expand them, and choose whichever ones you want. Also, if you hover over them, there's a little information icon on the far right. And if you go to that, it'll show you a lot of information about what this formula or function is expecting. So if this aggregate function, for example, is made up of an array, an initial, and an aggregator, it shows you what they are and some things to look at what they look like. A little description, this performs a specified calculation for a list of a database with the option to ignore hidden rows and error values. And then it'll also give an example formula. So you can see an example of what that formula looks like. You can even copy that so that you can place it in your function in your function box to try it out and see what you can do with it. Once you have the function that you want to use, just a simple left click will add that formula to your formula box. So then you can start building with it and changing items in it to build up your formula. Then we have a unit tests tab. The unit tests tab pretty much the same as unit tests everywhere else in decisions. You have the ability to look at your sample data unit tests. You can run them, you can view them, you can change them, add new ones, whatever, all that stuff from this position, just like you would in making unit tests for a flow, for example, in the debugger. And then we have an integrations tab. So you can set up integrations, specifically just API integrations with these functions. So if you want to set up an API service integration here, you can easily do that from this menu and work on building that out as well. Then we have the actual formula box. So once you select and you have your stuff configured and you pick your function, it'll appear in the formula box. And the formula box is where we can go ahead and start building out anything that we need. When you add your function, you'll see green and purple typically. Green is representing the actual function itself. So if you see something in green, if it recognizes an object as a function, it'll appear in green for you, so you can see that data. If you see anything in purple, that's referencing an input. So that purple color, by default, it'll default with some input variables for that particular function when you first place it in. But if you replace it with one of your inputs from your that you've set up, like I did here, I have first number set up here, it'll still recognize it as an input and it'll appear in purple as well. If you change any of them to constants, then it'll make that value look black. So just to reference that it is a constant value and a little bit different than coming from some variable somewhere else. So you can still distinguish those items as you're looking through them and setting up those inputs and things. Now we're going to take a look at this in decisions and we'll see how it looks. And then we'll come back and talk about a couple of other important things to see when we're building with this. All right, so here in decisions, let's just take a quick look at the things that you can check with it, and then we'll mess with this testing formula to show some of the things you can build with it. So like I mentioned, you can create the rule just by clicking create rule, and you have a formula tab, and you can build your formula from here. Creates your formulas just like it would create any other designer in decisions. We also have the ability, if I open up just a quick example flow here, I can use the run formula step to set up a formula, and then I can from here pick or create one. So if I have one that exists, I can grab it. If I don't, I can create a new one. So I have that option as well. And then like I mentioned, we have formulas you can build from here if you want to create your own formula, or if you have an existing one, you can add them directly under mapping to utilize them in a process. So you can use them as a step or even just set them up like mapping in a flow as well. And then lastly, if you have a statement rule, you'll see them appear. This declare option now will be on all your statement rules. So from there, you can easily create these items. Let me just remove, this is what it'll look like when you first open up a brand new rule and you haven't done anything with. Simply just clicking add, you'll be able to start building out your formula designer from there. So let's just take a quick look now at an example. So you build out your formula. We got your 4 tabs that I mentioned here. We can set up some input data. Let me just throw some examples in here so we can reference them. So we have a couple examples if we want to use them. So you can see the inputs there. Another thing, I'm actually going to add one more here. I'm going to add an account data type just to show I can still add data types to anything I want. Complex, not complex. Whatever it is that I need to utilize here. So I got some input data now. You can see my output type is just displayed. I can't change it like I mentioned. I can go ahead and look at functions and start adding things. Here's the full list. There's simple math functions. You can see a lot of cosines and tangents, absolute values, whatever you can think of. Majority of that stuff is going to be found in here, so you can use them. Even things as simple as finding the product, multiplying a list of items, and all that stuff. If I need information on something, I can see it, right? I can look at this. This function multiplies all the numbers in a range of cells. So it's kind of expecting this to have a list of items here, and then it can multiply all those items together. I can also see some information here as well. If I hover over something, especially default and I haven't changed it, it'll let me know if something is invalid. Hey, this is invalid because it's expecting a list of doubles, but this is just an object. It doesn't have anything associated with it yet. So stuff like that I can actually utilize in this. By simply finding a function that I want to use and left clicking it will allow me to start adding things into it. I have date specific ones as well. So if I want to utilize something with days, I can do that. You're expecting some kind of date time with a number of days here. If I wanted to add days to some specific date, a lot of different great ways to utilize things in this. And then again, I got unit tests and integrations, like I mentioned before. Pretty easy to see those. Let's just use the really easy absolute value since it just takes one input as an example here. So as I build up my formula, I can replace this x that it defaults to with anything I want. I can replace it with simply a number, right? And just like I said, a constant value will appear in black. It'll just show that number. I can replace it with one of my inputs. You notice I don't see things right away, but if I start to type them, if I know what my inputs are, you'll see them start to pop up. If I start to type things, it'll look for potential functions that I could add, thinking maybe I'm looking for functions, or it'll look for my potential inputs. So first numbers is one of the inputs that I had set up here, right? And so it'll put that here as a value, right? And so now I have that, and now it's expecting the absolute value of whatever this specific number input is. I accidentally added an S there, but that's okay. Let's say I want to put -5 in as an input on this. I have my little debugger that will allow me to run and test this formula so I can see how it works. So if I want to run this -5 through my absolute value, I hit play, it'll run it. It'll give me my final output. So it outputted a 5. It'll show me actually a tree of everything that was completed and checked. So I can see absolute value of -5 equals 5. So I can kind of see all of these different things if I'm looking for, data or looking for what I'm actually receiving in something. Oops, that was an accident. The more complex an example, the more details you'll have in the tree. So obviously I put a really basic one in there, but if I just go and let's find an example like aggregate, for example. If I build that, I can also copy this if I want to paste in an actual specific example, running the data through here. You can see now if it's a more complex formula, it gives me a full tree of everything that happened, showing every single individual item that made up this aggregate down to eventually getting to the final total. So I can see what it did with the array. I can see what it did with the numbers in the array. So it utilized the 1 here, it utilized the 2, it utilized the 3, it utilized the 4 from my array, and the results it got for each of those down to the final result here, giving me my final output. So it does really show you everything that gets completed there. So it really helps you kind of figure out what exactly is happening, especially the larger, more complex your formula is going to be, the more that this debugger that's going to be necessary, right? Especially if those that remember their days in math classes, when you have those really long steps of doing complex things, it could, little things could easily mess it up. But this allows you to check all of that and view all that information. Other things that are important to note, just one other thing I want to mention, something like the add days. So I can pull this, right? This is just a number. I can easily pull this from one of my input numbers, right? If I want to grab second number, it'll drop down and show me. If I want to input something here, right? I need a date time. I don't have any inputs exactly. I have a date time, but I do have my account. So I can pull the date time from my account, for example. Now, if I just start typing something like created on date, I'm not going to see that value appear here, right? I know that the account created on date exists in the account, but if I start typing it, I'm not seeing anything. If I start to type account, I can see that account example input appear here. And so I can grab that, but this still isn't going to work. It's invalid because this is an account data type and it's not my date time. So if I want something to go further into a complex data type, simply typing it isn't going to work. However, if I add a period after that account data type, you'll see now it'll start to actually display for me all of the pieces of information that are underneath that complex data type. So simply adding a period and then continuing to type. If I add a C, I'll see all the ones that have C's in them, and I can see my created on date here to grab it. So now it'll say, okay, based on some account example that I have from my input, it's going to grab the created on date from that example, and then it's going to add these number of days to it. So if I pick that, let's just go ahead and pick my account here as an input. Now it'll do that. But again, it's important to add that period to get further into a complex data type is necessary. So it doesn't just give me a drop-down menu of everything everywhere. I have to first specify which input complex type I want to start drilling down into, add a period, and then from there I can get the rest of the information that I need to. So just keep that in mind if you're utilizing any complex types that you need to drill further down into, that's what you're going to have to do. And so then I can run it through it, and you can see what it does. It'll grab those numbers. Let me actually put a number to add to it so you can see that utilized. Right? It'll output, first it grabs the created on date. It was created on 8/2/2024. Then it adds the 5 days to it. So now it's 8/7/2024, and that's the final result there with the date time for the 5 days being added to that first value. Right? So there's a lot of different great ways that I can utilize these formulas in decisions so that I can kind of build things up. And again, tons of different functions, great ways to utilize them. They do, display examples and, what the expectations are of these things, so you can utilize them as well. One final thing that's important to note that I will mention also on the slide again, but I want to show it because I have an example here, is anything that's expecting a list of values. If you have a list as an input, you're fine. But if you don't have a list as an input, and maybe you want to build the list in the formula using a bunch of other individual inputs, or maybe you want to build the list with a bunch of constant data, you will need to use the make array function. So you can see that here in this example. It is a separate function. It does exist, and it may be required. It's automatically nested in certain functions that require a list of items. Something by itself that isn't an input will not be a list. So this and is expecting a list of things. If I try to put my first number into here, it's not going to be valid because it's not necessarily a list or a second number or anything like that, right? But if I need to use a list, it's the make array function. It does exist here, like I can add it as well manually, or I can type it if I want to type it. But anything that utilizes a list will use a make array function with it, unless the input is already a list. So if I again, if I'm trying to get like the count of something, for example, right? The count of simply, 1, 2, 3, 4, I can add that array, but if I want to utilize it, I may want to do make array or something like that to actually utilize it properly. So lastly, I just want to point out a couple other little points, some things that I already mentioned. The make array formula may not be as obvious, but it will be nested in certain things. So just keep in mind that. You can find it there if you want to click on it and utilize it as well. But sometimes certain ones, especially functions like this aggregate, for example, that have multiple properties, you can't just use something with an array by itself. You'll need that make array function first so that it doesn't get confused with which properties are which. For example, if I just tried to make this aggregate formula with aggregate 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, blah, 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 with the rest, it won't work. But as soon as I use the make array formula with the 1, 2, 3, 4 in parentheses there, it'll function properly. If I do have something, I believe, that is a single array, only expecting one array, then it doesn't matter. Like you don't need make array to do that necessarily, but the more complex your formula is, the more likely you are to need to use make array, and that could potentially cause some issues if you're not using it. So definitely pay attention to that. Also, removing a formula in the rule designer will fully remove it. You saw earlier in the video when I was demonstrating and showing how this declare works. If I click remove, it will remove it. It does not give me the ability to call back to it or to reference it again or anything like that. It doesn't ask me to create it. It will just automatically remove it. which does bring me to another point about those. Uh, Within rules, this we'll skip to this third one, but formulas within rules cannot utilize pre-made formulas. So if I'm adding a formula in a rule with that declare function, it will be creating a new formula. So when I click add, it'll give me the opportunity to make a brand new formula and I can add that. So it just, at least at the moment, I cannot call pre-made formulas anywhere when I'm just in the rule designer. All other instances, I can call previous rules for the mapping, for the pick or create formula in a flow, or when I'm building a new one. Obviously, I'm just building a new one, but those can utilize formulas that I've already built somewhere. In the rule designer, I cannot. Also, at the moment, we can only create formulas from decisions set of formulas. That list that you saw in that functions tab is our current list. There's no custom formula building kind of concept here. It's just using all the formulas to build up your own formula there. Um, you may be able to combine a number of things if you have some kind of formula. There may be some formulas that do technically combine other formulas into its formula, but that's just because it's a popular or typically common use case kind of formula thing. So, but anything that is there in those functions are the only options at the moment. No telling whether that's going to be something that we add down the line, or we may be adding more formulas if things get requested and things into the formula designer. But at the moment, whatever's there is what we have. Well, this concludes our video over the formula designer. Hopefully this helps you to build out great new things in decisions. Thank you for watching.